Thank you. I will take the opposite position, as you may imagine. I'm want to talk about three things. First is, what are the possible endgames of all this situation with Iran? Then, what would be the results of not attacking Iran? And finally, what would be the results of attacking Iran? I think there's a little bit of difference between my view of what the endgame may be and Matt's view of what the endgame may be. I think I agree with him that a settlement, a sort of grand bargain, is unlikely, but I don't think the other two options are only strike or acquiesce to nuclear Iran. There's strike, there's acquiesce to nuclear Iran, but there's also persuade the Iranians that a latent capability in which they maintain, control the fuel cycle, but they do not weaponize their nuclear capability is also a possible endgame. And in fact, one of the consequences of an attack, as I will argue later, is that it makes this endgame less likely. That is, the more we antagonize Iran on this topic, the less likely it will be that they will be persuaded that a latent capability is sufficient. And so the more likely it will be that they will weaponize in the end. On the consequences of not attacking Iran, there's three consequences that Matt mentioned that are usually mentioned in this context. One is nuclear emboldenment, what they would do if they would get nuclear weapons. The second one is a nuclear cascade in the Middle East, the possibility that other states would follow suit and acquire nuclear weapons. And the final one is the likelihood of accidental exchange, so escalation to the nuclear level in a future crisis in the Middle East. And I want to tackle those in turn. The first one, emboldenment, it's important to notice, first of all, that it depends on the weaponization of the Iranian nuclear program. That is, emboldenment would happen if the Iranian, might happen if the Iranians would actually weaponize their nuclear capability, but with the latent nuclear capability, it's hard to figure out how the Iranian regime would feel emboldened internationally if it doesn't actually possess a weapon. But even if it possesses a weapon, the key question to ask, and I haven't seen a good answer to the question, is what are the actions, the Iranian actions, the actions the Iranians would like to take that we're currently deterring, that we would no longer be able to deter if they acquire a nuclear weapon? What is it that Iran wants to do that it can't do today because it doesn't have nuclear weapons, but could do in the future if it had nuclear weapons? And I haven't seen a good answer to this question. Does it want to close the Straits of Hormuz? Does it want to supply more advanced weapons to Hezbollah? Does it want to encourage terrorist attacks on the US homeland? All of these actions would threaten the vital states of Iran, even if it possessed nuclear weapons. In fact, you could make the argument that particularly if it possesses nuclear weapons, it runs a grave risk of nuclear retaliation if it takes any bold action against Israel or the United States, because we're not in the habit of attacking or of launching nuclear attacks on non-nuclear states. But if Iran insists on weaponizing and then provokes a crisis that puts at stake the vital interests of Israel and important interests of the US, it is possible that they would suffer a devastating nuclear strike. And so I don't think that nuclear weapons change the Iranian regime's determination to survive, and I don't think that nuclear weapons change the fact that Iran cannot prevail against an Israeli-US coalition. So I don't know which of the actions that Iran would like to take and can't take now, which of those it would take in the future as a result of having nuclear weapons that would, in fact, create serious trouble for Israel and the US, while at the same time not risking the survival of the Iranian regime. And still on this question of emboldenment, I'd like to note what I think is an internal contradiction in Matt's argument, which is that if we strike Iran preventively, we can expect the Iranian regime to be particularly rational and indeed restrained in their response. We can tell them we're only going after the nuclear program, so don't go overboard in your reaction. And Matt expects them to react with great restraint. But once they acquire nuclear weapons, there's sort of a magic potion effect in which they become unrestrainable. So it changes their preferences in a way in which they become a grave threat to international stability, whereas if we attack them now, they will actually be kind of okay with it and will take a strike on the crown jewel of their regime with aplomb and without going overboard in the reaction. And I think you have to have it one way or the other. You can't have it both ways. And trying to have it both, the impossibility of having it both ways means that an attack cannot be limited, because the Iranians would retaliate en masse, or is not necessary. So if the Iranians are so restrained that they would not retaliate against an attack, they are likely to also be restrained once they possess nuclear weapons. So it's unlikely that it's both possible to have a limited strike and a necessary strike. The second point I'd like to talk about is, in terms of consequences of a potentially nuclear Iran or with a latent capability, is the possibility of a nuclear cascade. And this is in the Middle East. This is of the three effects of not striking Iran, the one that's more likely to obtain, I think, in Matt's argument, even if Iran acquires a latent capability. I'm extrapolating, you don't have a point on it, but I'm extrapolating from your argument, that even if Iran only has a latent capability, it would be likely that other states in the region would follow suit. The states we're talking about are usually Egypt, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, sort of a cascade of proliferation in the Middle East. I'd like to note a couple of things on this topic. First, the US has existing security assurances vis-a-vis these states based on current capabilities, without the need to spend more money than we're already spending, that give these allies little incentive to nuclearize. In fact, I would argue that looking at the history of the nuclear era, there is no example of a US ally on which the US exerted significant pressure against nuclearization that still went ahead and acquired the bomb. The US has been consistently successful in preventing its allies from proliferating. There's the case of Pakistan. We can talk about it in Q&A. The US was not consistently putting pressure on Pakistan not to proliferate throughout the 80s. Much to the contrary, turned a blind eye. Egypt and Saudi Arabia are among the greatest recipients of US military support. Turkey is the second largest military in NATO and is under the US explicit formal security umbrella. Iraq is a bit more complicated. It will either turn towards Iran, in which case it won't nuclearize in response to Iran, or turn against Iran, in which case it's likely to need US support. So it's unlikely, in my view, that even Iranian weaponization would result in a nuclear cascade in the Middle East. So the broad record is that the US is consistently successful at preventing US allies from acquiring nuclear weapons. The third point that Matt makes would result from Iranian nuclear acquisition would be the possibility of accidental escalation. But as is the case with emboldenment, this would require actual weaponization. So if we would settle and the Iranians would settle for a latent nuclear capability, it's hard to figure out how that would lead to escalation in the context of a crisis, because you actually need a weapon to escalate in the context of a crisis. But even if you have one, the argument Matt makes is that Iran and the US and Iran and Israel lack the communication channels and the type of assurances that, say, the US and the Soviet Union had during the Cold War that allowed us to de-escalate a number of crises. But I'd like to note that, for instance, during the Cold War, the hottest crisis of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, is before we have robust communication channels with the Soviets. It's before the Soviets have a long experience at managing a large arsenal. They had a large arsenal for 5 years at most during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's unclear whether they had retaliation capability, and still they backed down. So we can use history to make the opposite point, but all I'd like to argue is that there is no historical evidence that would lead you to believe that escalation is a likely event. Even in relations between Pakistan and India, since both went nuclear, we have never seen crises, and we've seen quite acute crises, we have never seen them escalate to the nuclear level. So now let me talk a little more briefly about what would happen if we attack Iran. I have 4 points to make in which I think I differ from what proponents of an attack believe. The first point is that an attack would be far more costly than is expected. That is, an attack would not be comparable to an attack on Syria. This is an analogy that makes no sense. The Syrian nuclear program was limited to one facility. We're talking about a couple of weeks of attacks. In fact, if you look at even the press, you will see that it's an attack that's likely to stretch Israeli capabilities. Well, if it's an attack that's likely to stretch Israeli capabilities, Israel is not a particularly weak country conventionally. So we're not talking about one strike one day. We're talking about a couple of weeks, a month of consecutive bombing and then assessment. So that is far more costly and far more likely to generate a reaction from Iran than I think proponents of an attack think. The second point is that the results of attacking Iran, and I think here I'm in agreement with Matt, an attack would not end a program. An attack would delay a program. We disagree on the assessment of for how many years, but I think we agree on the assessment that the program would not be ended. And in fact, that's the historical experience we have. The 1981 Israeli attack on the Osirak reactor, if anything, we know now from the documents that came out of Iraq, led Saddam to redouble his effort to acquire nuclear weapons, and he was only ultimately led to drop the program around 1995 as a result of a sanctions regime. So, containment, a sanctions regime, would be the aftermath of an attack. We would need to continue an effort to persuade Iran not to weaponize, so an attack is not the end point. Alas, at the same time, an attack would decrease the likelihood that we would be able to assemble the kind of international coalition that would be able to put a containment regime in place. That is, if we attack, we make it harder to contain Iran, and therefore less likely that Iran would be persuaded to not weaponize its nuclear program. Whereas at the same time, it would be, and this is the third effect, it would be, its resolve would be boosted by an attack. Its perception that it requires a nuclear capability, in fact, to defend itself from what is a very concrete threat, because they have just been attacked. So it would be even less likely that we would be able to persuade them not to weaponize. So Iranian resolve is actually great already, I think. I don't have any doubt that they are pursuing a nuclear weapons capability, not the weapon itself. But I think it would be even redoubled in terms of resolve if we attack them. The final consequence of an attack is that the likely end game, and I touched on this already, the likely end game would become weaponization. So it's less likely that we'd be able to persuade Iran to settle for a latent capability after an attack. And so I'd conclude by saying, just very quickly, that I think we should heed the lessons of North Korean nuclearization here. That is, the US was gravely concerned with the aftermath of a North Korean bomb, but we haven't seen emboldenment. We certainly have not seen a nuclear cascade. The US has been able to maintain its robust assurances, security assurances to Japan, South Korea, preventing a cascade. We haven't seen escalation during the crisis around Thanksgiving. A couple of years ago, we haven't seen any escalation on the part of the North Koreans. So I think that would be a better model to look at this, a better template to look at this case than the possibility of a strike succeeding. Thank you.